Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Classroom Café podcast. I'm Janice Acosta, social worker and substance use liaison at the UFT's Member Assistance Program. Our co-host, the lovely and wonderful Salma, is also here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Selma Williams, mental health manager here for the United Federation of Teachers Members Assistance Program.
Today, we are joined by Julie Flynn Badal. Julie is a published writer, seasoned educator, and the creative director of the Meadow. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
So today we're talking about benefits of mindfulness and the expressive arts and how that can play out in our personal lives as well as in the classroom. So do you want to give our listeners a little bit of background about who you are and how you came to specialize and really focus the work that you do every day on mindfulness and the expressive arts?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Janice. So I come to my career in the healing arts as a healing arts consultant, primarily for educators and working in classrooms. As a classroom teacher myself, I worked for more than 20 years as a classroom teacher in a variety of settings. I worked in public school settings, starting out in bilingual classrooms in the Chicago public schools, and also worked in a variety of private school settings. And I noticed for myself as a teacher that I really needed my modern dance practice after school, that sometimes I would even set aside, grading papers and lesson plans to dance, because I showed up in my classroom with the most presence and vitality as a result of dancing. And in the Chicago public schools, I was charged as a very young person with over 32 children in my classroom, sometimes as many as 34. And we really thrived in the classroom. I really allowed them, because I was young and had tons of energy and was willing to try all kinds of things. We had a very creative workshop going on, and I actually worked with a number of artist educators through a program called ACEs, Art-Centered Educators. So I got to partner with the most amazing artists in Chicago. There were dancers and theater people and visual artists and sculptors, and we created these collaborations in which children got to represent their learning in artistic ways, so reinforce what they were learning through the content, and we would go ahead and backtrack the outcomes. So I noticed that being in my body, giving my kids after recess or after lunch or even in the morning, moments of pause and silence, and then allowing them also to express themselves was just phenomenally wonderful and delightful. They all went ahead and scored well on tests and understood the curriculum and thrived, really.
Wow.
And so I actually used a lot of my work with those kids to apply out of nowhere to art school, and miraculously got into art school through really my children's work. I take no credit. It was really all the beautiful poetry they wrote and paintings and dances they created and all kinds of things. And my intention was to continue working in education and the arts. But in art school, I was plunged in as a public educator into a very different setting, in which people were, really scrambling to be art stars and to get their work in galleries, and it was a completely different mind. And it wasn't a place that I felt necessarily comfortable or happy. And that's where I really started my spiritual journey, and really dove more into what is the purpose of art? What is the purpose of, what was I really doing with these kids, and what were we bringing forth? And I think that's where I really became interested in the contemplative practices, the meditation, the embodied movement. The reason I like dance is because it was embodied, I got more into yoga and qigong, and that I began studying the Tibetan Lam Rim and Zen and all kinds of things. So really, my art practice was about connection, meaning, presence, happiness, love, all these things that we need more of in the world. And
Mhm.
when I returned to the classroom, I continued on doing that. But I realized, I was actually then hired as a consultant to work with Chicago educators. And when I moved to New York, continued. Now I'm a vendor for the DOE, and
Okay.
I share these practices when I can. And I went back to school recently to get my degree in expressive arts therapy, and really understanding the therapeutic and mental health benefits of expressive arts combined with contemplative practice. So that's my journey.
Yeah. So you share that you yourself as a child really connected with body movement and dance. And then when you became an educator in the Chicago public schools, you really channeled that passion and love for dance into something that was really useful for your students. You found that when they had a space for movement and to express themselves in their bodies, that they were really able to focus better and connect with the curriculum more and perform better academically.
Absolutely. There's something
Mhm.
about the way that we've organized our world, our classroom, that we kind of default into these ideas of, I think we mentioned before this idea of, we're sitting at these rectangular desks in this rectangular classroom, in this rectangular school, in a city that's sort of very, very built in these sort of squares. And here you have this beautiful child who's nothing like, more like a tree than a rectangle.
Mhm.
And sometimes we tend to forget because, we have so much, as educators, we have so much put upon us that, we tend to forget that these are bodies and minds together. And also there's this interesting relationship with time that happens. I notice
Yeah.
oftentimes as a teacher, I had an antagonistic relationship with time. It always felt like there wasn't enough because, of course, there isn't enough
Mm,
time.
Mhm.
And that creates stress. That's literally what to me the definition of stress is, right? Like sort of feeling like you're racing against time and you're not in time, but time is sort of you're in competition with it somehow.
Mhm.
And that's not a nice place to be. And of course, then we can't really show up and be present for the kids, and the kids also, because that's so contagious, also feel that way. And as we know, as studies have shown, stress doesn't lead to learning. And so, yeah, I think these practices kind of open up time. It shows us that we have
Mm.
more time when we take time to actually settle into our body and to go slower,
mhm.
and to breathe, that there's actually ample time. There's an abundance of time.
Mm.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? But I feel that showing up for the kids is a way for them to show up for you. We talked
Yeah.
about the idea of the whole classroom being kind of like a it has its own neurobiology, and the teacher is the leader of that. They're setting the conditions for learning. And those conditions have to involve the body. They have to involve the breath. They have to involve a sense of calm. And so the question is sort of how do we as educators create the space for this under this enormous pressure, in this
Mhm.
Mhm.
bureaucracy,
Mhm.
in these schools that can be fairly pressurized and stressful? How do we create that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my initial thought, for an educator who might be struggling or struggling with the idea of getting into their body, right? It seems to me what I'm hearing is that you have gone through such a journey, right? This has been a journey of you understanding yourself and thus being able to support your students better. So, yeah, where would be, I guess that's my question, what tips do you have, right, for an educator who just wants to begin their journey? They may be struggling with movement or with mindfulness, not
Mhm.
understanding how to just begin to
Yeah,
explore this area.
yes. That's such a great question. Thank you, Selma. I think there are multiple ways of beginning. One is to simply, think about the time in your classroom where you have a moment for pause. It could be 30 seconds. It could be that before your students take an assessment, you ask everyone to put their pencil down and to take a breath and to collect themselves and tell them how much you care about them and that it's going to be okay. And
Yeah.
then they take the assessment. It could be as little as that, right? But
Okay.
we tend to forget, just like as parents, we tend to forget these things in our rush. That could
Yeah.
make all the difference in how that child performs on that assessment. It could be that another way is to look at the whole classroom as a container, in which you, the teacher, is not so much a person that's delivering information, but that you're setting up conditions for the body mind to be present and to learn what is needed to be learned or to inquire. And so how do you look at the classroom as a container, a ritual container, where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, much like like writer's workshop, right? Where we have the initial sort of, okay, this is the routine we get into. We take a moment to breathe together at the outset. We set an intention for this time together. Let's say we have 40 minutes together. You're teaching high school math. We set an intention. We breathe. We teach a mini lesson. And then there's a check-in again, just like you would do with mindfulness. How does everybody feel? Okay, let's check in with ourselves. Let's feel our feet on the ground. Let's feel ourselves in the chair. And then there's a close, where you've kind of review what you've done that day and close the practice. Again, this could be just simple closing one's eyes and breathing. This could be a check-in in which, say, at the beginning of the class, everyone shares gives their emotional temperature. How are they feeling that day? You could have a chart if you're young, teaching younger kids, a chart on the wall. I'm sure a lot of teachers already have this, in which there's this sort of check-in. You could include movement, chair yoga, simple stretching. You could include music when the kids are working. There can be artwork that is used to express abstract concepts, even in math. Let's actually, let's do an abstract painting of what you just learned and explain it back to me in your journal, So there's myriad ways, but starting small is just taking that first moment, that first breath, that first moment of silence, that first time you put classical music on, instead of just the drive towards finishing the outcome, that first time you check in with each person. Another idea is that you could create a completely different shape for your classroom. The classroom, the circle does not have to be something that preschool teachers do at the start of the day or kindergarten teachers do, and then everybody else forgets about it. The circle could be the way that you communicate in the classroom. Your desks or chairs could be in a circle at all times, and a talking stick could be the tool that you use, where one person speaks at a time, where you come to consensus about things, where questions are asked more than answers are given, right? Where there's kind of a deepening in a group process. And I do train teachers and librarians and other nonprofit leaders on how to use circles as a tool for learning and inquiry and collective decision making. And so there's just so many ways. I feel like I'm getting this was a very long-winded answer, but I hope it's helpful.
No, I think in your answer, you were able to paint a couple different ways that educators can, in the classroom, start to implement different things in their classroom, whether it's, assessment or, before an assessment, or even just an everyday practice. And you also spoke about even just the ambiance in the classroom too, and how to move it away from the squares that are all around us into circles that are more inclusive.
There's also, different workshop models. There's different uses of sound for breaks, singing bells you can bring in, and chimes, and and as I mentioned, using art as a reflective practice. There's so much of art making is about bringing the body into the moment, about focus and concentration and representing learning in more complex ways than just, sort of a teacher calling on students and answering.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned, and it's something that, uh, is used in our world often, getting into your body. And
Mhm.
somebody hearing that for the first time might think that it's a unusual phrase, right?
Mhm.
So what do you mean? What do you mean getting into your body? What is explain that for us?
Mhm.
Well, as busy teachers and urban dwellers and students who are arriving to the classroom from, getting off the subway and from a variety of stimuli, we often arrive in the classroom with our amygdala stimulated, and in which we're in our lower brain. We're in kind of a fight, flight, adrenalated state,
Mm-hmm.
in which there's a dissociation between the cognitive processes and the body. And, many of us learn to function that way and even can be quite successful that way. Although, the levels of cortisol going through your system are very bad for our health. And it's also shown that, it's not the optimal performance state. And so the idea of getting into one's body, connecting with one's breath, grounding, feeling one's body again, taking a moment to, as I said before, sort of feeling the seat beneath your thighs, feeling one's feet on the floor, even, using very gentle movement to return to the body is really a form of, ironically, like brain integration, where you're actually connecting the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, where there's kind of this vertical integration of the brain as well as horizontal integration of the brain. And by that I mean that you're switching out of fight flight into a more attend and befriend state, a more relational and communicative state. And this is where all of our executive function, our planning skills, our memory, our imagination in the prefrontal cortex, the top of the brain, this is where all of that is found. And so to get into the body means also to integrate the brain. And so there's really no split. We talk about mind slash body, but really it's really all one. And so when we're dissociated from our body, that's an indication that we are in kind of a fight flight mode. Our lower brain, our amygdala is stimulated.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a way of optimizing. Getting into the body is not a waste of time or just some sort of like, kumbaya, nice, airy fairy thing to do with little ones.
Mhm.
It's actually a way of optimizing our capacity, our cognitive capacities.
Yeah, I like that. I've never made that connection really, like using it as a way to optimize how you're able to process information. And I think for an educator, that's like the key draw, right? Like that's the way to
Mhm.
pull them in. Like, okay, every teacher wants their students to be able to retain, to
Yeah.
soak up everything that they're sharing. So using this as a tool to really begin to settle them and open their minds up to what the content, right, that's going to be poured in is it's really, yeah, that's amazing.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I think, you mentioning Selma, the word retention is super important. So, when our amygdala is running the show, that's our lizard brain, right?
Mhm.
That's meant for emergencies, and it's meant for, say, like, picking up the pickup truck that, is, over your toddler's leg or something, like it's meant for like heavy duty stuff. It's not meant for retaining information. It's meant for quick bursts of energy to avoid, being eaten, as the cliche goes, like being eaten by the lion in the jungle, or avoid the speeding car that's coming down the street. Um, it's not meant for long-term memory storage. So if
Mm.
you're teaching, it can be the most brilliant lesson that you've spent hours
Mhm.
planning intricately and thoughtfully. But if you or the children are coming in a stressed out state, in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that information is just staying on the surface and won't be retained.
Yeah.
So it's a protective measure too, right? Because it's using, the body is using all its energy to survive, and survive that moment, and not in long term
Yeah.
planning.
So I think, when I hear expressive arts, right? Like me I'm not much of a like artist per se. I think painting, I think all the things that I don't necessarily like or am good at. um, I'd like some other, and you mentioned some, earlier on, but for the teacher who doesn't have that proclivity, what are some other things that they can do to help children express themselves?
Okay, so backing up about sort of talent, giftedness, proclivity in relationship to the expressive arts. The reason so expressive arts is a specific field, as as compared to, say, fine arts, right?
Mm,
So when we think of someone who has an MFA, or they're focusing on fine arts, you're talking about someone who's got those 10,000 hours behind them, right? You're
mm,
talking about a master, or someone that's striving for mastery and striving to kind of be the best in their field, or be very, very, very detailed and gifted at what they do, have a lot of the technique. The expressive arts is very different. When we talk about expressive arts, we're talking about process. We're talking about really kind of a form of mindfulness. It's not about this beautiful painting that is potentially the principal can put up in the hallway, or about this finished piece that you can present to parents at Thanksgiving time or something like that.
mhm.
It's nothing like that. It's really just using the arts to access all these different forms of intelligence, right? So, we have different learners in the classroom. Some of them are visual, some of them are rhythmic, some are analytical, some are linguistic. And even if you're in a math class, how do you access these different learning styles? And this is where we just invite teachers to feel free, and for students to feel free, that this is not about who has the prettiest painting, or who can do a rond de jambe or plie, or who has this gorgeous singing voice, or anything like that. This is about representing the content of the curriculum in different ways to access different learning styles. So just feeling free to bring out the paints and saying, hey guys, let's close our eyes, and sort of with our eyes closed, even with the wrong-handedly, let's sort of just represent abstractly, like what we just learned. What does it feel
Mm,
like? What color would it be? So the idea of, I'm saying closing one's eyes, which isn't necessary, but like the idea is, it doesn't really, it's not so much about the product, but about this process of accessing different ways of knowing that we've abandoned in these sort of very colonial systems, where we privilege certain ways of knowing over other ways, where now through the expressive arts, maybe we can reclaim our
mm,
whole body, our whole mind, our whole expressive capacity, by just giving different kinds of materials and playing. And so when I work with teachers, I often encourage them, to also give themselves permission to be creative. And I sometimes work on professional development workshops in which we explore that in ourselves, our own fears of creativity, how it's been shamed out of us, because
yeah,
creativity isn't quote unquote productive. You can't
yeah,
commodify it. You can't measure it. You can't.
yeah,
These are things that we've been conditioned out of, and it's at the cost of our own depth and well-being and happiness and our own fullness.
yeah,
So yeah, why not have, we have this amazing opportunity where we have these young people in this room with us for a certain amount of time every day. Why not explore all the ways that you can approach the content to reach every one of them, so they're not left out because they have a different learning style.
yeah. I like that. I like that. And
Yeah.
while you were talking, I started to think, and you can give me an example if you have one of your time as an educator. Did you ever experience a student going through a rough time? maybe displaying some behaviors and having some challenges that you wouldn't, approve of in the classroom. And were you able to use any of these tools in that moment to help the child regulate?
Absolutely. This happens all the time, actually, especially as you bring up, as you start to sort of show up for the kids in different ways,
Hmm.
different behaviors will surface.
Mm-hmm.
And so here the idea is, how do you create a container for safety for them, for other people, for yourself?
Yeah.
Um, and I've been trained and this is where circles come in handy, because it's a container in which there are ways in which we it's protective. The structure itself, the way that the talking stick works, the way that the prompts work, the way that the community holds everyone's experience is a protective measure. But things do come up, and it's not a perfect process. Stuff comes up, and sometimes you have to take the student aside. Sometimes the student needs to leave. Sometimes I need to work separately with them in the, in an office or somewhere else, or we breathe, or there's, schools in which there's these beautiful mindfulness rooms, rather than sort of going
Mhm.
to, say, like there's a school in John Wayne's Elementary School in Williamsburg has, a place in which there's all kinds of uh, materials that students can use to regulate themselves, again, whether there's like a little privacy tent, like a little Buddha booth, there are squeezy toys, there's artwork, there's, or
That's so
there's art
cool.
materials, there's soft chairs and bean bags they can sit in, there's a
Mm.
place where they can listen to music, it's so beautiful. And so, this is an example of a school that's done a really good job, and I know a lot of, in the New York system are doing this now, using their funds to create these spaces. But yeah, like going with a student into a room like that and just letting them learn to self-regulate, talk to them, name what they're feeling. I mean, of course, teachers have these skills already. It's not new to most people that are listening. But
I think the key here
yeah,
is access, though, like where you
Yeah.
that's beautiful, right? And having this room, this where there's sensory things and um,
yes,
tools for the children and adult. Like we need one in our office, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
at our disposal. I think it is amazing, and I'm hoping that this is a trend, right? That this will begin to start developing in all of the our schools, nationwide. As a parent, I think about, even with my own children, I have a daughter who's neurodivergent, and the first time she remembers being seen was when a teacher, instead of, she likes to rock in her chair,
hmm,
and instead of making her feel like this behavior was inappropriate and that she should sit still, they bought her a rocking chair.
oh, that's awesome.
I
Oh,
didn't know about
wow.
it until months later. And she's like, yeah, this is mine specifically for me. This is a rocker for me. And she felt so proud to say that my teacher thought about this. She thought far
Mm.
ahead. I mean, she thought about her as an individual. But again, not every educator is able to do that. Not every school is able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think highlighting the creativity of the educators and the staff in the building to really come up with cost-effective ways that can have the same effect.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, the idea of the teachers needing a break, I think it brings to mind Francine's Buddha booth, right?
Mm,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've interviewed her for the podcast, but yeah, teachers are just really enjoying knowing that, even knowing, and maybe not even using it, but knowing that they
or
have permission to give themselves a timeout and go and chill in the Buddha booth uh, for several minutes a day. And for those who don't know what that is, that's our colleague Francine Stedman created a company called Buddha Booth, and they're just these little phone booths
Mm-hmm.
that teachers and students can use. They're about the size of a phone booth. They're not phone booths, they're meditation stations. And teachers and students can take a break, 5 to 7 minutes in there, guided meditations. There's different aromatherapies. There's mindfulness cards. There's gongs and chimes and things that you can listen to. And so I think building that into the, it's an inexpensive way of building that into the school culture,
Yeah.
and normalizing our need for self-care.
Yeah.
And supporting it. So that's one way. And I just love that rocking chair story, because it's just, yes, this is the way, like embracing difference and knowing that none of us are cookie cutter.
Yeah.
Each of us have our way, and to just, not alienate children for having their way of coping.
Yeah.
It's just so beautiful, just embracing that difference. And that's where I see, something like the expressive arts taking mindfulness to sort of a new place. Because I think there was a point, the reason I got my expressive arts therapy degree is because it felt as if at a certain point, mindfulness for what? Where are we taking this? We're taking this moment of silence. Okay, now I've gathered my life force. I've done a bit of qigong, and I feel balanced and ready. And what is my unique way of expressing myself in the world? It's kind of back to the rocking chair. What is my signature in space? What is my way? And I feel like mindfulness is sort of setting up the child, teacher, the whole group to innovate, and to go beyond what's being asked for them, or go deeper into what's being asked of them.
Yeah.
Rather than staying on the surface, because now you've got the whole beings there showing up for you.
Yeah.
And we're as human beings, we're gifted, we're survivors, we're resilient, we're innovative, we're geniuses. And so why not harness that genius and show each other who we are in different ways, because that's what the world needs right now, right? We're so shut down.
Absolutely.
And we're being asked so little in a way. And yet it feels so stressful. And perhaps it's because it's too narrow. It's not really addressing our humanity. It's serving some other strange purpose that has nothing to do with children or teachers.
Yeah. I like that. I think, we are, well, not we, because I'm not an educator, but, I can imagine educators coming from a very structured and goal-based and results-based model. And sometimes that can dehumanize us. We are not just people that produce, right? We are human beings.
Right.
We have humanity that trumps all of that. And I think, we had our podcast with Mosa Koot, and she talked about, just we talked about just bringing your humanity in every situation, and letting that be, your guide. And I think if we can all do that, educators, every profession, we just have a better time understanding each other. Overall.
Absolutely.
So beautifully put, so brilliant. Yes, education is not about units of production, or creating commodities of our work, or of humans. What is the point of education, right? It's inquiry, it's self-knowledge, it's connection with others. It is about our humanity. And I mean, I know I sound very idealistic, and for those who have very, very specific outcomes that they need to reach, this may feel like way too woo-woo, but I think there's room in every field for pause at the very least, for breath, for inquiry, for recognition of what's come before that classroom and what comes after, the life that this young person is living. Before we ask them to perform, quote unquote, for us, right? And that's really the core of it. It's not so much about who's the best meditator, or who can, who can tap dance. It's about, it's about learning together in a way that's joyful.
Yeah. I agree.
We were talking a bit before about access, and it was brought up in a couple different ways. Like Julie, when you were sharing about how even a math teacher could implement expressive arts in their classroom. as you were speaking, I was like, I've never even thought about that, like having like the relationship between art and math. There is academically, right? There's a relationship, but like expressive arts and math is something totally different. And so even as an educator, being able to access and think in that way of like, how can I utilize expressive arts to benefit my students in the classroom, is something that you have to be able to access and think about it in that way. And then we also talked about access in regards to, right, even just based on like the economic structure of the individual school, and having access to a mindfulness room or even a Buddha booth or something like that. And so I wanted to shift that thought and like that focus on how our educators can find ways to practice expressive arts and mindfulness in their own lives, so that way when they are in the school buildings, they do have access
Mhm.
to these things that they can utilize in the classroom.
Yes, that's a beautiful point, because it does require a certain degree of bravery and playfulness. If
Mhm.
we're going to include the expressive arts, even mindfulness requires a
Mhm.
certain amount of faith, I suppose, in oneself and one's students, that this is not goofy, that this is important, that this, you know, is something that will be helpful and useful. And I think that courage, that playfulness, that faith can only come from one's own experience with it.
Mhm.
And so, I was also trained through mindful schools, and one thing mindful schools always emphasizes is that we start with the faculty. We start with the teachers and the administration, because if we don't start with the students, because we're not there all the time.
Mhm.
We're,
Yeah.
it's like it's coming, it has to come from the hearts of the teachers. The teachers have to want this.
Yeah.
And they will create the mindful school if you plant that seed and it grows effectively, right? So yes, and it kind of goes back to my original experience as a young person, where I had a lot of energy and I could actually take dance class after a full day teaching.
Mhm.
um, and you mentioned that I had danced as a child. I did not actually. I actually started dancing, you know as a teacher.
Oh.
I was
Interesting.
not at all exposed to the arts as a child. Did not have that experience, but did find that it helped my teaching so much. So
Mhm.
yeah, that didn't happen until my 20s. And I just encourage other educators, yes, or first of all, for administrators, to create professional development experiences that include these practices, that include, say, what do circle talks look like with teenagers versus preschoolers? What does a circle talk look like when you're trying to actually teach something within a circle, where there's actual content to be explored or a
Mhm.
decision to be made as a group? What are some really basic meditations that I can lead, that me as a teacher, I don't have to have some other person come in, but me, as a teacher, what can I lead in the classroom? What can we
Mhm.
expose our teachers to so that they feel confident that they can lead a guided meditation? And what are the kinds of meditations that will be, and visualizations as well, that will be most useful for this particular classroom? How can the individual educators inquire and explore what kind of meditation works for their content, for their curriculum, for their subject matter?
Mhm. Mhm.
And then workshops in which, maybe it's like, for example, I work with a bunch of Montessori schools, and they do this lovely retreat at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And um, the one at the beginning of the one, where was it? I'm trying to remember the name of this beautiful park we went to up in Riverdale on the Wave Hill. We did
Mm.
a retreat at Wave Hill. The teachers had a beautiful catered breakfast and lunch. The administration decided, you know what, we need to invest in the well-being of our teachers if we want them to stay.
Mhm.
So
Cool.
rather than end the year with this retreat, let's begin. Let's begin together. Let's go to Wave Hill. Let's sit under some trees. Let's meditate with Julie. Let's do qigong. Let's do yoga. Let's get in groups and ask ourselves important questions. Let's create, let's explore. They have the best time. And then those teachers will stay, those teachers
Yeah.
will stay, and they actually are more invested in what's happening in the classroom, and they care about one another because they got to spend this, what was actually quite magical time out in nature. So I just encourage administrators to give these opportunities to play, to explore, to bond, not just at the end of the year when it's all over,
Yeah.
like right at the outset.
Yeah.
And yeah, any kind of arts. And then for individual educators, I know there's so much pressure and it's so much work, and it's not just obviously an 8 to 3 job. It's, all weekend long, you're grading papers and planning. But if there's any space to just say, you know what, maybe my self-care is just as valuable as a beautifully, planned lesson plan. And because, showing up exhausted and a beautiful plan, as we know, doesn't necessarily cut it. So giving yourself permission, and this is tough. Again, we have families, we have so much, but to take that class, to take that workshop, to, even if it's online, just to experience what it's like to be vulnerable artistically again, so we can relate to our students and develop that courage, that curiosity, that playfulness that might be required, and that the students will love.
Wonderful. I love everything that you had to say, Julie. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Yeah. So Julie, for our listeners out there, if they're interested in more information on you or the wonderful work that you do, where can they find you?
So I have a website. It's just my name, www.julieflynnbadal.com, and I'm sure that will go in the show notes for spelling. And I recently started a newsletter through Substack, and that newsletter is called the Meadow. So if you go to Substack, which is a kind of newsletter resource, and there's lots of fun ones there, just search my name, Julie Flynn Badal, or you can search for the Meadow. You can also just email me directly at juliefly@gmail.com. And I just assume all this will go in the show notes, but I'm happy to give half-hour consultation to teachers. I'm happy to work one-on-one with teachers in classroom or outside of the classroom. I'm happy to give professional development retreats, in-service days, workshops, or come and work with your students directly.
Yeah. You spoke a lot about administrators giving opportunities for their staff to, engage in these mindfulness activities or expressive art activities. Are you available for those sorts of PDs and workshops as well?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Julie. This is such a wonderful conversation. We appreciate your time and all of your expertise that you brought to our members today and our listeners.
Thank you so much, Janice and Selma. It's been an honor. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.